So as an introduction to this, we know that our food supply consists basically of plants and animals or products that are derived from plants and animals. And so it is understandable that our food supply can contain microorganisms in interaction with our foods, right? So we know that these plants, these animals are being grown out in nature and so forth. So it's not unrealistic for us to understand that our food supply can contain microorganisms that are in some type of interaction with our foods. All right. These microorganisms use the food supply as a source of nutrients for their own growth, right? So these same, foods that we consume, they can potentially be contaminated with or contain microorganisms that are also seeking out sources of food and nutrients for their own benefit. All right. So there's a number of different possibilities, particularly two that we can hash out in terms of the relationship between microorganisms and the foods that they interact with. All right. So one of the possibilities is that these microorganisms will result in some type of deterioration of our foods. So jot that down. We're looking at possible outcomes of interactions between microbes and our foods. So food spoilage, right? It's one potential outcome. We're all very familiar with the looks of these images that I have here. You've got mold and so forth growing on our foods. So foods that are like natural food sources that have not been chemically altered and so forth will certainly succumb to the microorganisms that are present in our environment over time, right? So we've all seen bread spoil before, fruit starting to spoil and so forth. It's due to the presence of microorganisms. All right. One of the things that you probably have noticed here lately is that your food doesn't spoil as quickly as it used to, right? And I'm still on the fence on whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it certainly lends credence to the fact that we are able to the food like bioprocessing and so forth has improved, and we can undergo food preservation methods and systems in order to prevent the growth of microorganisms, right? And so again, there's certainly, a lot of debate about the use of preservatives and so forth, and depending on what's being used, because while the goal is to reduce or prevent the growth of microorganisms or keep the food from spoiling, are we introducing other harmful chemicals into our bodies and causing other problems in this process, right? So two possibilities as we look at the interactions between microorganisms and our food. One being food spoilage, and then the other is that these interactions can be very beneficial, right? So interactions between microorganisms and the food can give us some very great benefits. We know that we harnessed properties from microorganisms in a lot of our food and drink and beverage production, right? So cheese, yogurts, beer, wine, these all fermented foods, these are all exploiting properties of microorganisms, right? So it is very important that you can sort of intelligently discuss, if you will, the two possible arms for the importance of microorganisms in our foods. There are certainly desirable outcomes or possibilities, but there are also those that are not so desirable when you think about food spoilage, the onset of foodborne illnesses, food poisoning. You've probably heard about those before. So for example, we can use fungi, right? As we are in food production for cheeses and so forth. Cheesemakers are adding the P. roquefort to milk. So you'll see it present throughout these cheeses. You can see the sort of the blue mold growing. All right, it's producing sort of these blue veins that characterize these cheeses. So we do often exploit properties of microorganisms in food production. Okay. And so, well, then what's happening when we see this sort of deterioration or food spoilage, right? So how can microorganisms cause deterioration of the foods? So when the organisms utilize the nutrients of the food, it can basically result in chemical changes in the foods. Okay. So for example, new compounds can be synthesized that are going to cause for this food to start spoiling, or these microorganisms can release enzymes that again are going to contribute to changes in the biochemical properties of the foods. Okay. And these enzymatic changes can result in, again, like breakdown and changings of the flavor and taste of these food products, right? So very undesirable effects when you talk about interactions of microbes with foods from an undesirable standpoint. They can synthesize new compounds that are essentially going to cause the food to spoil, and they can also result in like enzymatic activity or changes that will also change the taste of our microorganisms. All right, so let's jot down a few of the importance of microbes in our foods. And again, we're looking sort of from a good standpoint and from a bad standpoint. All right. From a good standpoint, we rely again on microorganisms for food bioprocessing, food biopreservation, and for the development of probiotics. Right. We're definitely in this probiotic era right now as we understand the overall role of our gut microbiota in our general health. So we have several studies right now that supports the use of probiotics for good gut microbiota, for our healthy gut bacteria. So we know that our bodies are populated with bacteria all throughout, and in our stomach and intestines and so forth, there are populations of good bacteria that help us stay healthy and help to get rid of those undesirable strains of bacteria. So we do, there's evidence to support the use of probiotics in our foods. And then on the other side, there are some undesirable important factors for microorganisms in our food. Again, the onset of foodborne illnesses and food spoilage. All right, these are very important public health concerns because food spoilage has a very important impact from the standpoint of sickness as well as economics. All right, there's a huge proportion of our food that we waste, that goes to waste, food food spoilage, and it's due to the presence of microorganisms. So it is of importance from a health standpoint and from an economic standpoint in this country to be able to contain, right, the presence of these microorganisms in our foods that's causing food spoilage. Right, we waste millions and millions of pounds of food each year due to spoilage, right? And so we'll talk a little bit on Wednesday about the deeper ways that we can prevent food spoilage and food borne illnesses in terms of making sure we prepare our foods properly, make sure we store our foods properly. We'll talk a little bit about cross-contamination and all those kinds of things. But anyway, jot these down. I would like for you to be able to discuss these both desirable and undesirable important factors for microorganisms in our foods. All right, so let's look at these: bioprocessing, biopreservation, food bioprocessing, food biopreservation, and the use of probiotics as good outcomes for interactions with microbes in our foods. And then we'll take a look at foodborne disease and food spoilage. So from a desirable standpoint, food bioprocessing, which basically means that we are using some type of biologically derived or biological material to generate food products, right? So food produced by using biological processes, right? So in this process, basically we're using food grade microorganisms to produce different types of fermented foods using raw materials from both animals and plants, right? So you'll hear, or as you read and explore additional resources, you'll see the terms starter cultures, right? So we use these starter cultures for fermentation, all right, for production of these fermented foods, all right? And we know that, again, these are from both plants and animal sources. All right. And so microbial enzymes are also being used to produce food and food additives. All right. So food bioprocessing is something that we heavily rely on. We cannot negate the role of microorganisms in our food production. All right. So it is an important point of note here in our discussion on food microbiology. So we're using biological material to generate foods, okay, or food products. And so these, again, these biological materials or biologically derived substances are typically cells of bacteria, yeast, fungi, different plants and animals, okay? And then also the enzymes of these organisms can also be used for the production of food and food additives, right? So what is a starter culture? These starter cultures are a sort of concentrated preparation of live cells that's added to raw materials in order to initiate this fermentation process, all right? And so we end up with our cheeses and wines and so forth as a some of our food products that can be produced via fermentation. Another use is food biopreservation, right? So food biopreservation is a food biological preservative by using antimicrobial metabolites. They're basically components that are taken from microorganisms in order to control pathogenic and spoilage of our foods. All right. So this food biopreservation is a process in which we are treating or handling our foods in a certain way, essentially to prevent the growth of microorganisms. Okay, so the goal here is to keep the food from spoiling after harvest or after slaughter, right? So we're understanding that our food sources, you know, can vary from plant to animal sources, and so depending on, you know, slaughter or harvest, we have to take certain measures again to prevent the growth of microorganisms, right? And so this is the process of food biopreservation, okay? In biopreservation, beneficial bacteria are used to prevent food spoilage and to get rid of harmful pathogens, okay? Lactic acid bacteria is one of the common organisms that are used due to some unique properties that they have, and they render themselves typically harmless to healthy humans, okay? So as long as you have an intact immune system, your introduction of lactic acid bacteria typically is going to be harmless, right? And so these lactic acid bacteria are releasing antimicrobials, right, such as the lactic acid or acetic acid, hydrogen peroxide, other substances or metabolites or byproducts that can stop spoilage and inhibit the growth of potentially harmful pathogens, right? And so by definition, that makes it an antimicrobial property, okay? All right, so that's food biopreservation. And then we have these probiotics. Many of you probably have at least consumed probiotics in the form of like maybe a yogurt or some type of over-the-counter probiotic that you can buy from your walk-up pharmacy. So probiotics are a concentrated supplement of some beneficial bacteria, right, culture that's intended to improve our health by promoting our body's natural immunity and improving our digestive system. And so again, there's a lot of research now that supports the use of probiotics for our overall health, right? Boosting natural immunity and improving digestion, improving our overall gut microbiota health, the overall health of our gut microbiota, all right? Trying to keep things nice and balanced, right? And these friendly bacteria help to prevent the colonization of those potentially pathogenic organisms, all right? So If you don't, I encourage you to do a little bit more research and see if probiotics are something that you may be interested in, or talk to your healthcare provider about the use of probiotics for your overall health. All right. Certainly, there's evidence to suggest great benefits. Okay. So the examples of probiotics in our foods, you've got milk, you've got yogurt, you've got cheeses that can all be fortified with these friendly bacteria in order to improve our health. Okay. Milk can be added with lactobacillus. Yogurt, cheeses as well can be sort of fortified with these lactobacillus bacteria in order to be used as a probiotic. All right. So from a negative standpoint, again, while, you know, with most things, we've got both, you got to take the bad with the good. These microorganisms, these same ones that we also love for the production of our food and beverages and so forth, they also can be problematic. Okay. Foodborne disease, foodborne illness is a major health concern in this country. It's certainly somewhat in the role of preventable. All right. While we cannot prevent 100% of foodborne or contamination, because microbes are all around us. And again, if you leave an orange out or a piece of bread out long enough, it will obviously become inhabited with microorganisms over time. But there are a lot of things that we can do that can prevent the onset of foodborne illness and food poisoning. Okay, it's most commonly referred to as food poisoning. We can take some measures, and we'll talk about them a little bit more on Wednesday, to prevent the contamination of our foods, right? So foodborne disease is a disease caused by the consumption of some contaminated foods. Okay, and this contamination occurs at various stages in food production. Okay, so at some point between handling, production, and making its way to the shelf, this food is becoming contaminated with some microorganism. Okay, and the consumer, right, for whatever reason, if it's like a cold beverage or something that does not have any further processings, or if you're cooking some contaminated meats and so forth, and you don't cook your meats to the proper temperature, you are going to end up consuming a potentially pathogenic microorganism, right? So bacteria, molds, viruses, these are all potential foodborne microorganisms. All right. Viruses, you know, hepatitis A can cause foodborne illness. Bacteria, you hear about salmonella and so forth. There's many different types of potentially pathogenic organisms that can cause human disease. All right. And so again, you're understanding that at some point from the different stages of handling between production and consumption, these foods become contaminated. Food spoilage, again, refers to a condition of contaminated food due to the growth of microorganisms or the action of microbial heat stable enzymes. So some food spoilage is due to the presence of the actual organism, and others are caused by enzymes that are produced and released by these organisms. These enzymes and toxins can be released, and they can also cause food poisoning. All right. So this spoilage, again, is important because it leads to a lot of wastage of food and economic loss. And we have to take those things into consideration, because we're battling a number of issues here in this country from a healthy standpoint, as well as from, you know, trying to combat poverty and food shortages and so forth. And so when you think about food spoilage and the thousands and thousands of pounds of food that we lose each year due to food spoilage, it's certainly an area of concern, and certainly worth further exploring ways to prevent such spoilage. All right. So for economic gain and for our overall health, because this food spoilage in certain countries where food is scarce and so forth, individuals take risks in consuming food that probably has past its data consumption or showing signs of spoilage. And some people may still be tempted to eat those things. And so biopreservation is important. All right. We certainly want to continue to research and explore ways of food biopreservation that can alleviate some of this spoilage. All right. So there are some factors that are going to influence the growth of microorganisms in our foods. And the more that we understand about these factors, the more prepared that we are to sort of combat, okay, this growth. So intrinsic factors, these are inherent in the food. That's going to include things like the pH of the food, the moisture content, the nutrient content of the food, antimicrobial substances, and sort of the biological structure or makeup of the foods. All right. So jot some of these down as we're thinking here. Okay. So what are some factors that are contributing to the growth or presence of these microorganisms in our foods? There are a few, some that are intrinsic, some that are extrinsic. I would like for you to be able to identify and describe factors that influence the growth of microorganisms in our foods, right? So the pH, moisture content, the nutritional content, these are all going to play a role in which microorganisms can actually thrive in these foods products. Okay. So the pH, most bacteria are going to grow best at a neutral or weakly alkaline pH, usually between 6.8 and 7.5. They're not going to typically survive in those acidic environments. Okay, so some of the other ones like yeast and molds can grow within a wide pH range, right? So molds can grow anywhere from 1.5, which is acidic, to 11, right, which is an alkaline pH. All right, while yeast are going to grow anywhere from 1.5 to 8.5 pH. All right, so the pH of our foods can determine or influence whether or not these microbes will be able to grow. Okay, so the natural pH of some other food sources that we consume, beef, chicken, milk, cheese, all right, oysters, fruits are going to typically have an acidic pH. Vegetables can usually range in that acidic pH. All right. Microorganisms that are able to grow in acid environments are called acidophilic microorganisms. I would like for you to jot some of these terms down. Okay, so we have the acidophiles that they're going to be able to thrive or survive in acidic environments. Okay, they are able to grow at a pH of around 2. Okay, that's a very acidic pH. Yeast and molds are examples of organisms that grow under acid conditions. All right, typically you're not going to see a lot of bacteria growing in that range. Other microbes such as Vibrio cholera are sensitive to acids and prefer a more alkaline environment. All right, these are bacteria. Vibrio cholera are sensitive to these acidic environment. Okay. All right, most bacteria are killed in strong acid or strong alkaline environments, except mycobacteria being an exception. All right. Moisture content. So the effect of moisture is in terms of the water activity, how much moisture is in this food source. Okay, so the amount of water that's present is going to influence the growth of microorganisms. Okay, if there's a lack of free water or moisture in these food items, microorganisms won't grow as well. All right, so moisture content is definitely a factor that influences the likelihood or the ability of microorganisms to grow in a food product. Moisture nutritional content of the food, right? So just like we have specific nutritional requirements to stay healthy, microorganisms also require a repertoire of proteins, carbs, lipids, waters, other nutrients, sulfur, phosphorus, vitamins, minerals for growth, just like we do. Okay. And so certain foods have specific nutrients that can help in microbial growth. So things like our milk and poultry, meats, eggs, these are going to contain a number of the nutrients that these microorganisms require to grow. And that's why we often see these foods contaminated quite easily with microorganisms. Okay. And so these foods are susceptible to microbial spoilage because, again, they basically are the ideal environment for the growth of these microorganisms. Okay. So milk, meat, eggs, dairy, these are all typically going to be easily contaminated with microorganisms. Okay. Antimicrobial substances in the food inhibit microbial growth as well. Okay. And so some foods, again, have these inherent antimicrobial substances that prevent microbial attacks. So again, we've got like the lactic, the anti-coliform factors, you've got lysozymes in eggs. So certain food products, depending on the source, plant or animal, there can be inherent antimicrobial substances that prevent microbes from colonizing. Okay. And then the biological structure of these foods. Some foods have biological structures that prevent microbial entry. For example, meat have different skin and fascia, other membranes that are going to sort of provide like this protective barrier and prevent microbial entry. Okay. Eggs, again, have that shell, and then they have that inner membrane that prevent yolk and egg white from being infected or contaminated. All right. So again, we're seeing a number of different intrinsic factors that influence whether or not these microorganisms can contaminate our foods. All right, so those are some intrinsic factors. All right, let's look at a few extrinsic factors that affect microbial growth. So these are external factors. Extrinsic factors are these that we control, if you will, the environment, the temperature, the humidity of the food storage. These are all factors that we can control and manipulate. So they're not inherent to the foods, right? But they are external. Okay. So temperature of storage. All right. This is a very important consideration with food microbiology. Our foods have to be stored properly in order to prevent the growth of microorganisms and to prevent spoilage. All right. The presence and concentration of gases in the environment, again, are going to play a huge role in maintaining these foods. All right. The relative humidity of food storage. So we need to make sure we're keeping our foods, things that need to be dry, like our dry goods and so forth, they need to be kept in a very nice and dry environment. No moisture or reduced moisture or humidity. All right, in order to preserve these dry items like our beans and so forth. And so different foods have different requirements for temperature, gases, the humidity. All right, but these are all factors that we can control that ultimately influence microbial growth. All right. So temperature. All right, the growth of microorganisms is affected by the environmental temperature. All right, again, various microorganisms are able to grow at certain temperatures, but not others. Right, we can classify or identify organisms based on their preferred temperature growth. All right, the thermophiles, mesophiles, psychrophiles, depending on the preferred temperature of growth. Okay, so microorganisms can be divided into the following groups depending upon their optimal temperature for growth. So let's look at a few of those. The saprophytes, these are organisms that are going to grow best in very cold environments. Write that down. Okay, saprophilic organisms are going to grow best at about 20 degrees C, but also down to negative 10 degrees C in unfrozen media. But these organisms are going to grow best in very, very cold environment. Okay, these saprophilic bacteria can cause food spoilage at low temperatures. Okay. Several of the bacteria that are found in soil and water belong to this group. Acrobacter, Flavilobacterium, Pseudomonas, Micrococcus. These are all saprophytes. Okay. Mesophiles, these are organisms that grow best between 25 to 40 degrees C with an optimal growth temperature around 37 degrees. And so this is going to be where you find most of your pathogenic bacteria. Okay, so none of the mesophilic bacteria are able to grow anywhere from 5 degrees or below 5 degrees or above 45 degrees. Okay. Again, as I said before, most of our pathogenic bacteria are going to belong to this mesophilic group. Okay, jot that down. That optimal growth temperature of 37 degrees is equivalent to human body temperature. Okay, so this is where we're going to find most of our bacteria are going to like to grow between 25 to 40 degrees C. All right. Mesophiles. All right, thermophiles. These are organisms that can grow in very high heat, very extreme temperature. Okay, temperatures above 45 degrees C. All right, often their optimal growth temperatures is between 50 to 70 degrees C. So bacteria in this group are mainly spore formers and are of importance in the food industry, especially when you're talking about processed foods, because we use heat as one of our antimicrobial agents, if you will. Okay. And unfortunately, there are some that can survive. And typically, again, these are going to be spore formers. So we can see problems with that because we're using the autoclave as a means for sterilizing foods products and other equipment that we're using. But if these organisms are able to form endospores, they are a little bit more heat resistant. Okay. All right, so the concentration of gases in the environment. All right, this relates to the presence and concentration of gases in the food environment. Various microorganisms require different oxygen, either high oxygen or low oxygen, or the absence of oxygen in order to grow optimally, right? So this is a factor, again, that we can control, right? This is an extrinsic factors, right? Some microorganisms may grow either in high oxygen or the absence of oxygen. And so we can identify or classify bacteria based on their atmospheric oxygen requirements. Okay. Aerobic, anaerobic, facultative anaerobes, obligate anaerobes, right? We certainly can classify these organisms based on their oxygen requirement or gas requirements in the environment. All right, so microorganisms can be grouped into categories based on their requirement for oxygen. So we have our aerobes. Aerobes are going to be organisms that grow in the presence of oxygen. Okay. Obligate aerobes require oxygen for growth and carry out aerobic respiration. So obligate aerobes are organisms that absolutely must have oxygen, and they require this oxygen in order for aerobic respiration to take place. And we know that aerobic respiration is how these organisms generate energy, right? Microaerophiles, they're going to grow at reduced oxygen concentration. Facultative anaerobes can grow in the presence or absence of oxygen. Okay. If there's no oxygen available, they can carry out anaerobic respiration, which again is another way to generate ATP. Right. So facultative anaerobes can grow in the presence or absence of oxygen. And then we have anaerobes, right? Strict anaerobes are sensitive to oxygen. Oxygen basically will be lethal for them, right? So anaerobes do not require oxygen for growth, okay? Therefore, they grow only in the absence of oxygen, so under anaerobic conditions, all right? I do want you to be able to distinguish between these groups of microorganisms based on their requirement for oxygen. We have our aerobes, microaerophiles, and facultative anaerobes and anaerobes, all right? Lastly, the humidity. Okay, the relative humidity is the amount of moisture in the atmosphere or the food environment. Okay, foods with lower water activity placed in high humidity environments take up water, increasing their water activity, and get spoiled easily. Okay, so it is important for us to know the moisture requirement of the foods that we're trying to store and preserve. All right. So for example, dry grains and so forth stored in environments with high humidity will take up that moisture and obviously start, mold will start growing and we'll see spoilage. All right. So the relative humidity of the environment is important. All right. So we can stop right here. I know this was a lot of information today.